23-year-old Rebecca thought she was marrying into a loving family. She thought Richard Harrison, her wealthy father-in-law, was her biggest supporter. She thought his generosity came from the heart. But what looked like a blessing was actually a trap set by the very man who welcomed her with open arms. A trap that would destroy not just her life, but the lives of everyone she loved, until she found the courage to fight back. When you trust the wrong person with your vulnerability, when the people who should protect you become the ones who harm you, when silence becomes your prison and speaking up feels impossible, that's when you discover what you're truly made of. This is the story of a young woman who learned that sometimes the greatest enemy lives under the same roof. Before we dive deeper, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Rebecca Martinez had always been a dreamer. Growing up in a modest apartment in Phoenix with her single mother, she spent her evenings sketching wedding dresses in old notebooks, imagining a life filled with love, stability, and family traditions she'd never experienced. At 22, working double shifts at a local diner while taking night classes in business administration, she met Michael Harrison. Tall, kind-eyed, and soft-spoken, Michael seemed like everything Rebecca had dreamed of. He was the only son of Richard Harrison, a successful real estate developer who owned half the commercial properties in their small Arizona town. Their courtship was gentle, sweet. Michael would pick her up after her late shifts, bringing her favorite coffee and listening to her dreams of starting her own catering business someday. When he proposed after 8 months, Rebecca felt like she was living in a fairy tale. But it wasn't just Michael she was marrying. She was joining the Harrison family. And Richard Harrison made sure she knew it. The first time Rebecca met Richard, she was immediately struck by his commanding presence. At 58, he was still handsome, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from years of getting what you want. He embraced her warmly at dinner, telling her she was exactly what Michael needed, exactly what their family needed. "You bring something special to this family, Rebecca," he said, his hand lingering on her shoulder just a moment too long. "I can tell you're going to fit right in." Rebecca felt overwhelmed by his acceptance. Here was a successful, respected man treating her like a daughter, something her own father had never done. Richard insisted on paying for the wedding, brushing away her protest with a smile. "Family takes care of family," he said. "And your family now." But as Rebecca would soon discover, Richard Harrison's definition of family came with strings attached, strings that would slowly, methodically wrap around her throat. The wedding was everything Rebecca had ever dreamed of. Richard spared no expense. A grand ballroom, flowers flown in from California, a photographer who usually worked celebrity weddings. As she walked down the aisle, Rebecca felt like she was stepping into a new life. Michael's eyes filled with tears when he saw her, and Richard beamed with pride from the front row. "My daughter," he whispered to guests, gesturing toward Rebecca. "Isn't she beautiful?" But even on that perfect day, there were moments that felt off. Richard insisted on giving a toast that lasted nearly 10 minutes, talking about how he'd always known Michael would choose wisely, how he'd guided his son toward finding exactly the right kind of woman. He spoke about Rebecca as if she were a business acquisition he'd personally overseen. And when they danced, the traditional father-daughter dance, his hand pressed firmly against her back, he whispered, "You belong to this family now, Rebecca. That means you belong to me too." The newlyweds moved into a small house on Richard's property, a charming cottage that Richard had generously offered them. Why waste money on rent when family can help? He'd argued. Michael, ever grateful to his father, agreed immediately. Rebecca felt a flutter of unease but pushed it down. This was generosity, wasn't it? This was what loving families did for each other. Within the first month, Rebecca began to notice how often Richard appeared. He had keys to their house, of course, for emergencies. He'd drop by in the mornings when Michael had already left for work, bringing coffee and pastries. He'd stay for dinner most evenings, settling into their living room like he owned the place. which, technically, he did. "I hope you don't mind the company," he'd say with that charming smile. "I get lonely in that big house all by myself." But Richard wasn't just spending time with them. He was studying Rebecca, learning her routines, her fears, her vulnerabilities. He discovered she was afraid of conflict, that she'd do almost anything to keep peace. He learned that she worried constantly about money, about being worthy of the Harrison name. And slowly, carefully, he began to use that knowledge against her. The control started small. Richard would comment on Rebecca's outfits. "That dress is a bit too tight for a Harrison woman, don't you think?" Or her cooking. "Michael's mother used to make his favourite meals. I could teach you her recipes." When Rebecca got a part-time job at a local bakery to start saving for her catering business, Richard's face darkened. "We don't need the Harrison name associated with hourly work," he said firmly. "What will people think?" Michael, caught between his father and his wife, usually sided with Richard. "He's just trying to help," Michael would say. "He wants what's best for us." Rebecca found herself apologizing constantly, for working, for her clothes, for not knowing how to be the right kind of wife. She started changing, becoming quieter, more careful, always second-guessing herself. Richard's visits became more frequent. He'd arrive early in the morning, letting himself in while Rebecca was still in her robe. "Don't mind me," he'd say, settling at their kitchen table with his coffee. "I just like the company." When she'd retreat to get dressed, she'd find him looking through their mail, their bills, their personal papers. "Just trying to help with the finances," he'd explain. "Michael shouldn't have to worry about such things." The isolation was gradual but devastating. Richard would make cutting remarks about Rebecca's friends from work. "They're not really your kind of people anymore, are they?" When her mother called, Richard would answer the phone sometimes, chatting warmly before mentioning how busy Rebecca was, how she was learning to be a proper Harrison wife. Her mother's calls became less frequent. Rebecca began to feel like she was disappearing. The confident young woman who had dreams and opinions was being replaced by someone who asked permission for everything, who apologized for existing. And Richard watched it all with satisfaction, like a chess player who could see victory 20 moves ahead. Michael, loving but naive, saw his father's attention as kindness and his wife's changes as maturity. He had no idea that Richard was systematically isolating and controlling Rebecca, preparing her for something much worse. The first time Richard touched her inappropriately, Rebecca convinced herself it was an accident. He'd brushed against her in the kitchen, his hand grazing her hip as he reached past her for a cup. "Excuse me," he'd murmured, but his eyes held hers a beat too long. Rebecca's heart pounded, but she said nothing. What could she say? It was probably nothing, wasn't it? But deep down, Rebecca knew. The predator she'd welcomed into her life was finally showing his true nature, and she had nowhere to run. The harassment escalated slowly, like water rising around Rebecca's feet. Richard's comments became more personal, more invasive. When Michael worked late, Richard would linger after dinner, making observations about Rebecca's body, her movements, her clothes. "You're so young," he'd say, his voice different when Michael wasn't there. "So innocent. Michael doesn't appreciate what he has." Rebecca started to dread Michael's business trips. Richard used those absences as opportunities to assert more control. He'd call repeatedly throughout the day, checking on her, demanding to know where she was going, who she was with. "I promised Michael I'd look after you," he'd say. "That's what fathers do." But his definition of looking after became increasingly inappropriate. He began entering their house when Rebecca was alone, using his key without knocking. She'd find him in their living room, or worse, in their bedroom, examining her things. When she protested, he'd smile coldly. "This is my property, Rebecca. Everything here belongs to me, including you." The message was clear. She had no privacy, no autonomy, no rights. The financial control tightened like a noose. Richard monitored every expense, questioning every purchase. When Rebecca tried to save money for her catering dream, he'd find reasons why she needed to spend it on family obligations. He controlled their credit cards, their bank accounts, even their grocery money. "Michael doesn't need to worry about money," he'd say. "I handle all of that." Rebecca realized she had no financial independence whatsoever. She was completely dependent on Richard's generosity. The psychological manipulation was perhaps worst of all. Richard had a gift for making Rebecca doubt her own perceptions, her own reality. When she'd mentioned feeling uncomfortable about something he'd said or done, he'd look at her with confusion and concern. "I think you're misunderstanding my intentions," he'd say gently. "I'm only trying to help. Maybe you're under too much stress. Maybe you need to talk to someone." He'd suggest she was imagining things, being dramatic, being ungrateful. When Rebecca tried to talk to Michael about her concerns, Richard had already planted seeds of doubt. "Your father thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown," Rebecca would say, and Michael would look worried. "He mentioned you've seemed stressed lately," Michael would reply. "Maybe you should take some time to relax. Maybe stop working so much." Rebecca found herself trapped between the truth she lived and the reality everyone else believed. The abuse became undeniable when Richard cornered her in their laundry room one afternoon. With Michael at work and neighbours nowhere in sight, he pressed her against the wall, his hands exploring her body while she froze in terror. "You're part of this family now," he whispered against her ear. "This is what family does for each other." When she tried to push him away, he gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise. "Don't make this difficult, Rebecca. You have nowhere to go. No one will believe you. And Michael would never forgive you for accusing his father of such things." Rebecca's world crumbled. She realized that everything, the wedding, the house, the generosity, it had all been a carefully constructed trap. Richard hadn't welcomed her into the family out of love. He'd chosen her because he saw someone vulnerable, someone he could control and exploit. She was not a daughter-in-law. She was his victim. The abuse continued, hidden behind closed doors, disguised as family obligation. Rebecca lived in constant fear, never knowing when Richard would appear, what he would demand, how far he would go. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped being able to pretend everything was normal. But Richard was clever. He never left obvious evidence, never went too far in front of others. To the outside world, he remained the generous, loving father-in-law. Only Rebecca knew the monster behind the mask. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Michael had left early for a week-long business trip to Denver, kissing Rebecca goodbye and promising to call every night. Richard appeared at her door less than an hour later, using his key as always, but this time his demeanor was different, more aggressive, more entitled. "Michael's gone," he said simply, settling into their kitchen like he owned it, which he did. "That means it's just you and me for the next week." His eyes held a promise and a threat that made Rebecca's stomach turn. She tried to excuse herself, to get dressed, to leave the house. But Richard blocked her path. "We need to have a conversation about your attitude lately," he said. "You've been distant, ungrateful. That needs to change." What happened next broke something fundamental inside Rebecca. Richard made it clear that her resistance was futile, that he could do whatever he wanted whenever he wanted, that her body, like everything else in her life, belonged to him. When she threatened to call the police, he laughed. "And tell them what? That your loving father-in-law, who pays for everything you have, who gave you a beautiful wedding and a free place to live, who treats you like his own daughter, that this man hurt you?" His smile was cruel. "Who's going to believe that, Rebecca?" But worse than the physical violation was what came after. Richard sat at her kitchen table, calmly eating the breakfast she'd made for Michael, and laid out the reality of her situation. "You have no job, no money, no friends, no family who would take you in. Your mother thinks you're living a fairy tale. Michael thinks you're his happy wife. Everyone in this town respects me. I built half this place." He sipped his coffee casually. "If you try to leave, I'll destroy you financially. If you try to tell anyone what happened, I'll destroy you socially. And if you try to turn Michael against me, well, he'd never choose his dramatic wife over his loving father, would he?" Rebecca spent that day in a fog of despair. She looked around the cottage that had felt like a home and saw it for what it truly was, a prison. She saw her life for what it had become, a carefully constructed lie. She realized that Richard hadn't just stolen her body. He'd stolen her identity, her relationships, her future. She was trapped in plain sight, a victim that no one would recognize or believe. That night, alone in her bed, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She could continue living this nightmare, being slowly destroyed by a man who saw her as his property, or she could fight back. The thought terrified her, because she knew Richard held all the cards. He had money, power, respect, and her husband's loyalty. She had nothing but the truth, and lately even she had begun to doubt that. But as she lay in the darkness, Rebecca remembered who she used to be, the girl who had worked double shifts and gone to night school, the girl who had dreams bigger than her circumstances, the girl who had survived her father's abandonment and her family's poverty. That girl was still inside her somewhere, scared, bruised, but not broken. Not yet. Rebecca made herself a promise that night. She would not disappear quietly. She would not let Richard Harrison erase her. She would find a way to expose him, to protect herself, and to reclaim her life, no matter what it cost her. The prey was about to become the hunter, and Richard Harrison had no idea what was coming for him. Rebecca's transformation began with a trip to the public library. She told Richard she was grocery shopping, but instead she spent hours researching domestic violence, sexual assault, and legal options for victims of family abuse. She learned about documentation, about evidence, about the kinds of proof that would be taken seriously by law enforcement. Most importantly, she learned she wasn't alone, that other women had faced similar situations and found ways to fight back. The next step was getting a cheap cell phone with a recording app. Rebecca used her small emergency cash fund, $20 bills she'd been hiding in an old makeup compact, to buy a prepaid phone at a gas station across town. She practiced using the recording function until she could activate it silently, quickly, without looking. This phone became her secret weapon, hidden in different places around the house depending on where she expected Richard to appear. The documentation process was meticulous and heartbreaking. Rebecca started a detailed journal, writing down every incident she could remember, dates, times, what was said, what was done. She photographed every bruise, every mark, every sign of Richard's abuse. She saved every threatening text message, every manipulative email, every piece of evidence that showed his pattern of control. The hardest part was reliving it all, writing down the details that made her sick to remember. Rebecca began testing Richard's patterns, learning his routine so she could predict when the abuse would happen. She discovered he was most aggressive when he'd been drinking, most controlling when Michael was away on business, most manipulative when other people were around to witness his loving father-in-law act. Understanding his behavior helped her prepare, helped her position herself to capture evidence safely. The recordings were the breakthrough she needed, Richard's voice clear and undeniable, making threats and demands, his words preserved forever, showing his true nature. "You belong to me now, Rebecca. You'll do what I say or I'll make sure Michael divorces you and you get nothing. No one will believe you over me. This is what you owe the Harrison family." Each recording was a piece of ammunition in the war Rebecca was waging for her freedom. But gathering evidence meant enduring more abuse. Every time Rebecca documented Richard's behavior, she had to let it happen long enough to capture proof. She had to stay silent while he violated her, had to pretend to be broken while secretly building her case. The psychological toll was enormous. But Rebecca discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. The close calls were terrifying. Richard almost found her second phone twice. Once when it nearly fell out of her jacket pocket, and once when he heard an unusual beep while she was recording. "What was that?" he'd asked suspiciously, but Rebecca had covered by claiming her stomach was rumbling. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it, but she maintained her composure. Michael's return from his business trips became both a relief and a new challenge. Rebecca had to act normal around her husband while carrying the weight of what she'd experienced and learned. She had to smile and make conversation while planning her escape from his father. The guilt was overwhelming. Michael had no idea his wife was being abused by the man he loved and trusted most. 3 months into her evidence gathering, Rebecca had accumulated a devastating collection of proof. Dozens of recordings, hundreds of photographs, a detailed journal, and digital evidence of Richard's financial control and manipulation. She had documented a pattern of escalating abuse that would be impossible for anyone to dismiss or explain away. But she also knew that having evidence was only the first step. Now she needed someone brave enough to act on it. The hardest part of the entire process was maintaining hope. There were days when Rebecca felt like she was fighting an impossible battle, when Richard's power and influence seemed too overwhelming to challenge. But every time she wanted to give up, she reminded herself of that promise she'd made in the darkness. She would not disappear quietly. She would not let Richard Harrison win. Rebecca's first attempt to seek help was with her family doctor, Dr. Sarah Chen, during what she claimed was a routine checkup. Dr. Chen had been Rebecca's physician since she was a teenager, and she immediately noticed the changes in her patient's demeanor. "Rebecca, you seem different," she said gently. "More anxious, more withdrawn. Is everything okay at home?" The question opened a floodgate. Rebecca broke down completely, sobbing in the sterile examination room as she told Dr. Chen everything. The doctor listened without judgment, taking notes, asking careful questions about the timeline and nature of the abuse. "I believe you," Dr. Chen said firmly when Rebecca finished, "and I want to help you. But first, we need to document your injuries and get you connected with the right resources." Dr. Chen photographed every bruise, every mark, every sign of abuse on Rebecca's body. She performed a thorough examination and documented everything in Rebecca's medical records. More importantly, she connected Rebecca with Detective Maria Santos at the County Sheriff's Department, a specialist in domestic violence cases who had experience with complex family abuse situations. Detective Santos was a revelation. A tough, compassionate woman in her 40s, she'd seen cases like Rebecca's before, powerful men using family connections to hide their crimes. "The good news is, you've done incredible work gathering evidence," she told Rebecca during their first meeting at a coffee shop downtown. "The recordings especially, those are gold. But I need you to understand that bringing down a man like Richard Harrison won't be easy. He has money, influence, and a reputation to protect. He'll fight dirty." The legal process began immediately. Detective Santos worked with the district attorney's office to build a case, using Rebecca's evidence as the foundation. They obtained warrants for Richard's financial records, his communications, his business dealings. What they found painted a picture of a man who used his power to control and exploit others, not just Rebecca, but employees, tenants, and business partners who'd been afraid to speak out. Rebecca was assigned a victim advocate, Jennifer Walsh, who helped her navigate the complex legal system and prepare for what was coming. "The hardest part will be when this becomes public," Jennifer warned. "Richard will try to destroy your credibility, your reputation, your relationships. He'll paint you as a gold digger who's lying for money or attention. You need to be prepared for that." The support system that formed around Rebecca was life-changing. Dr. Chen provided ongoing medical care and documentation. Detective Santos built the criminal case piece by piece. Jennifer helped Rebecca understand her rights and options. Together, they created a safety plan for when Richard discovered what was happening, because they all knew that moment would come, and it would be dangerous. The hardest conversation was with Michael. Detective Santos advised Rebecca to wait until arrests were imminent before telling her husband, both for legal reasons and for Rebecca's safety. "Richard can't know that Michael knows," she explained. "If he suspects his son might turn against him, he could become desperate. Desperate people do dangerous things." As the investigation progressed, other victims began to emerge. Richard's former secretary, came forward with stories of sexual harassment and retaliation. A young tenant spoke about inappropriate advances and threats of eviction. A business partner revealed years of financial manipulation and intimidation. Rebecca realized she wasn't Richard's only victim. She was just his most recent target. The confrontation happened on a Thursday morning in October, exactly 6 months after Rebecca had made her promise in the darkness. Detective Santos and her team arrived at Richard's office with search warrants and arrest warrants, catching him completely off guard. For the first time in Rebecca's memory, Richard Harrison looked powerless. Michael found out when Detective Santos called him at work. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to meet me at the station. It's about your father and your wife." The conversation that followed shattered Michael's world. Rebecca sat beside him as he listened to the recordings, watched him see the photographs, witnessed his face crumble as he realized the truth about his father and the suffering of his wife. "Why didn't you tell me?" Michael asked, his voice breaking. Rebecca took his hand gently. "Because he made sure I couldn't. He isolated me from everyone, including you. He made me believe no one would believe me, especially not you." The pain in Michael's eyes was devastating, but behind it Rebecca could see something else: determination. Her husband was ready to fight for her. The arrest made headlines across their small town. Prominent developer charged with sexual assault and domestic violence. Richard's mugshot, so different from the confident businessman everyone knew, appeared on the front page of the local newspaper. The community was shocked, but some weren't surprised. Other victims began reaching out, sharing their own stories of encounters with Richard Harrison that had left them feeling violated and powerless. Richard's reaction was exactly what Detective Santos had predicted. His expensive lawyers immediately went on the attack, painting Rebecca as an unstable young woman who'd fabricated elaborate lies to gain financially from a generous family. They claimed she was bitter about her humble origins, jealous of the Harrison wealth, and willing to destroy an innocent man to get what she wanted. The media attention was brutal. Rebecca's life was dissected in newspapers and online forums. Her past relationships, her family's financial struggles, her job history. Everything became public. People she'd never met felt entitled to judge whether she was telling the truth. The weight of public scrutiny was almost unbearable. But Rebecca wasn't facing it alone anymore. Michael stood by her side at every court appearance, his arm around her shoulders, his voice steady when he spoke to reporters. "My wife is the bravest person I know," he said. "She risked everything to expose a dangerous man. I'm proud of her, and I believe her completely." His support meant everything to Rebecca, but it came at a cost. Michael had to accept that he'd been blind to his father's true nature, that he'd unknowingly enabled abuse, that his loyalty had been misplaced. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for December. Richard was released on bail, forbidden from contacting Rebecca or entering their property. But everyone knew the real battle was just beginning. Richard Harrison had money, power, and a lifetime of connections. Rebecca had the truth, the evidence, and a growing network of supporters. The question was, which would prove stronger when everything was on the line? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. If you've stayed this far, type in the comments, "I'm still here." Let's see how many of you are strong enough to follow this journey to the end. The trial began on a cold Monday in January, 11 months after Rebecca had first walked down the aisle believing she was joining a loving family. The courthouse was packed with media, supporters, and curious townspeople who wanted to see the mighty Richard Harrison face justice. Rebecca wore a simple blue dress, the same colour she'd worn the first time she met Richard, when she'd been naive enough to trust his warm smile. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Lisa Rodriguez, methodically presented Rebecca's evidence. The recordings played in the silent courtroom were devastating. Richard's voice, clear and threatening, revealing his true nature. "You belong to me. No one will believe you. I own everything you have." Each word echoed through the room like a hammer blow against his carefully constructed reputation. Rebecca's testimony was the heart of the case. For 2 days she sat on the witness stand and told her story in excruciating detail. She described the isolation, the control, the escalating abuse, the fear that had consumed her daily life. She spoke clearly, calmly, and with a strength that surprised even her. When Richard's defense attorney tried to attack her credibility, suggesting she'd fabricated everything for money, Rebecca looked him directly in the eye. "I never wanted Richard's money," she said. "I wanted him to stop hurting me." The defense strategy was predictable but vicious. They painted Rebecca as a manipulative gold digger who'd seduced an innocent older man and then cried rape when she didn't get the financial reward she expected. They brought up her family's poverty, her mother's past relationships, her brief struggle with anxiety. Anything they could use to make her seem unreliable or calculating. But the evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Chen testified about Rebecca's injuries and the medical documentation. Detective Santos explained the investigation and the pattern of abuse they'd uncovered. Most powerfully, other victims testified about their own experiences with Richard Harrison, creating a clear pattern of predatory behavior spanning decades. Michael's testimony was perhaps the most emotional moment of the trial. Rebecca's husband took the stand and spoke about the man he'd thought he knew versus the monster the evidence revealed. "I loved my father," he said, tears streaming down his face, "but I love my wife more, and I believe her. The evidence speaks for itself." His words carried special weight because everyone knew how much it cost him to testify against his own father. The defense tried desperately to create reasonable doubt. They brought character witnesses who spoke about Richard's generosity and community involvement. They hired experts to question the authenticity of the recordings. They suggested that Rebecca had misinterpreted innocent gestures and conversations, but none of it could explain away the mountain of evidence Rebecca had so carefully gathered. Richard himself took the stand on the final day of testimony. Dressed in an expensive suit, he maintained his innocence with the same confidence he'd once used to intimidate Rebecca. He claimed to love her like a daughter, to have only wanted what was best for her marriage to Michael. When the prosecutor played his recorded threats, he suggested they were taken out of context or somehow fabricated. But sitting just feet away from Rebecca, his mask occasionally slipped, revealing glimpses of the entitled, angry man she knew so well. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict that changed everything. Guilty on all counts. Richard Harrison, the powerful developer who had controlled so many lives, was finally held accountable for his crimes. Rebecca felt her knees buckle with relief. It was over. The truth had won. The judge sentenced Richard to 12 years in prison, with requirements for sex offender treatment and lifetime registration. He was also ordered to pay restitution to Rebecca and his other victims. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Richard looked back at Rebecca one final time. The hatred in his eyes was clear, but so was his defeat. The man who had once told her she belonged to him was now the one who belonged to the state correctional system. The months after the trial were a time of healing and rebuilding for Rebecca. She and Michael moved away from Richard's property, buying a small house across town with money from the restitution settlement. For the first time since her wedding day, Rebecca lived in a space that truly belonged to her. A place where no one could enter without permission, where she controlled the keys and the security and the peace. Therapy became an essential part of Rebecca's recovery. Working with Dr. Amanda Foster, a trauma specialist, she began to understand the psychological impact of what she'd endured, the hypervigilance, the anxiety, the way she still flinched when men approached her unexpectedly. These were normal responses to extraordinary trauma. Healing wouldn't happen overnight, but it was possible. Michael struggled with his own healing process. The guilt of not protecting his wife, of being blind to his father's true nature, weighed heavily on him. He joined a support group for families of abuse victims and began his own therapy. Their marriage, tested by the worst possible circumstances, grew stronger as they learned to communicate honestly about their trauma and their hopes for the future. Rebecca finally started the catering business she'd dreamed about before her world was turned upside down. Using skills she'd always possessed but had been discouraged from pursuing, she built something entirely her own. Her first client was Dr. Chen's medical practice, a lunch meeting that marked the beginning of Rebecca's financial independence and professional fulfillment. The community's response was mixed but largely supportive. Some people struggled to reconcile the Richard Harrison they'd known with the man revealed in court. Others blamed Rebecca for destroying a good family or questioned her motives, but many others, especially women who'd had their own uncomfortable encounters with Richard over the years, reached out with support and gratitude. Rebecca's courage had given others permission to speak their own truths. Rebecca became an advocate for domestic violence victims, working with Jennifer Walsh to improve support services in their county. She spoke at conferences and training sessions, helping law enforcement and medical professionals recognize the signs of family abuse and respond appropriately. Her experience, as painful as it had been, became a tool for helping others escape similar situations. The most important change was internal. Rebecca had reclaimed herself, the confident, determined woman who had dreams bigger than her circumstances. She was no longer the frightened girl who apologized for existing or asked permission to live her life. She had faced the worst kind of betrayal and emerged stronger, wiser, and absolutely certain of her own worth. 2 years after the trial, Rebecca and Michael renewed their wedding vows in a small ceremony surrounded by the people who had supported them through their darkest time. Dr. Chen was there, along with Detective Santos, Jennifer Walsh, and Rebecca's mother, who had flown in from Phoenix with tears of pride in her eyes. This time, Rebecca was marrying not just Michael, but the life they were building together based on truth, respect, and genuine love. Rebecca's story teaches us that family can be our greatest blessing, or our deepest betrayal. The people who should protect us can sometimes be the ones who harm us most. The homes that should be our refuge can become our prisons. But Rebecca's story also teaches us something more important, that courage can overcome control, that truth can defeat lies, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, will ultimately find its way. What Rebecca discovered in her darkest hour was that she had more power than she realized. Even when she felt completely helpless, even when Richard controlled her money, her movements, and her relationships, he could never control her determination to survive and fight back. That strength was always inside her. She just had to find the courage to use it. The question that haunts many people who hear this story is about Michael. Should he have known what his father was doing? Was he also a victim of Richard's manipulation, or was he willfully blind to signs he should have recognized? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Michael loved and trusted his father, and Richard was skilled at hiding his true nature from those he needed to fool. But love doesn't excuse blindness, and trust must be balanced with vigilance, especially when someone vulnerable is depending on your protection. For every person watching this story, there's a lesson about the importance of believing victims, supporting survivors, and recognizing that abuse can happen in the most unexpected places. Richard Harrison wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was a respected community member, a successful businessman, a loving father. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a suit and offers generosity while planning destruction. Rebecca's courage to document her abuse, to seek help, and to fight back in court didn't just save her own life. It protected future victims and gave other survivors hope that justice is possible. Her story reminds us that silence protects the guilty, but courage creates change. What do you think about Michael's role in this story? Should he have known what his father was capable of? Or was he just another victim of Richard's manipulation? How would you have handled discovering that someone you loved and trusted was capable of such betrayal? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories where truth wins in the end. And remember, when you see someone struggling, when you notice changes in a friend or family member that don't make sense, when your instincts tell you something isn't right, Trust those feelings. Ask the hard questions. Offer support without judgment. Sometimes the difference between a victim staying trapped and finding freedom is simply knowing that someone cares enough to listen and believe. Rebecca Martinez. Harrison's story didn't end with the trial. It began there. Today, she runs a successful catering business that employs 12 people, including 3 women who are domestic violence survivors. She's been married to Michael for 5 years now, and they're expecting their first child, a daughter they plan to raise knowing her own strength and worth. Richard Harrison remains in prison, where he'll stay for several more years. His empire has crumbled, his reputation destroyed by the truth he tried so hard to hide. But perhaps the most important part of Rebecca's story is this. She refused to let someone else's evil define her life. She took back her power, reclaimed her voice, and used her experience to help others find their own courage. She turned her deepest pain into her greatest strength. And that is what real victory looks like. Every time someone speaks up about abuse, every time someone chooses to believe a victim, every time someone offers help to a person in crisis, Rebecca's courage creates more courage. Her refusal to disappear quietly has rippled outward, creating waves of change that will protect people she'll never even meet. This is how one person's decision to fight back can transform not just their own life, but the lives of countless others. So what will you do with this story? Will you watch it, feel moved for a moment, and then move on? Or will you let it change how you see the world, how you respond to people in need, how you define your own responsibility to stand up for what's right? The choice is yours. But remember Rebecca's lesson. Silence protects the guilty, but courage creates justice. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for being part of a community that believes survivors and supports those brave enough to speak their truth. Until next time. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never underestimate the power of one person's courage to change everything.